The night Darcy Lancaster showed up at my garage, I had half an engine spread across my workbench and 3 days of missed calls from the bank sitting on my phone screen. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of cold that sneaks in before you're ready for it. Not freezing, but enough to make you regret not fixing the space heater when you had the chance. I'd been working on a '98 F-250 that belonged to an old man named Terrell, who couldn't afford to take it to a dealer, which was fine because I couldn't afford for him to go to one either. My shop ran on that kind of math. I heard tires on the gravel before I saw headlights. Nobody came out to Callaway Auto after 9 unless something had gone wrong. She came to the door still wearing what looked like dress clothes. Dark pants, a gray blazer with a smear of something on the sleeve like she'd leaned against a car without thinking. Her hair was pulled back but half of it had come loose. She was holding a manila envelope pressed flat against her chest, like it was the only thing she trusted. I hadn't seen Darcy Lancaster up close in maybe 4 years. I knew her the way you know everyone in a county with 12,000 people. Her father Harold's orchard sat on the other side of the fence line from my property. And Harold had been the kind of neighbor you don't appreciate until you've moved somewhere he isn't. He'd helped my father through 2 bad seasons without making either of them talk about it much. The kind of man who showed up and then didn't make you feel like you owed him. "Rhett," she said. "Darcy," I set down the socket wrench. "What happened?" She looked past me at the garage like she was deciding something. Then she came inside and stood near the workbench, not touching anything. "Dad's will had a condition in it I didn't know about," she said. I pulled out 2 of the least greasy shop stools from under the bench and gestured at one. She sat. I didn't. "What kind of condition?" She opened the envelope and pulled out a stapled set of papers. Legal documents, the kind with small print and county seals stamped in the corners. She smoothed them flat on the workbench between us. "If I'm not married to a county resident by October 31st, she said, "Roland gets operational control of the orchard." I read the clause twice because I thought I'd misread it. I hadn't. "He wrote that in?" The attorney said it's valid. Dad wrote it 7 years ago before I moved to Richmond. He updated the rest of the will once and kept that clause. She looked at the papers instead of at me. I think he was scared I'd never come back, that I'd let Roland manage everything from a distance, and eventually the whole thing would get sold off in pieces. I thought about Harold Lancaster, a quiet man with big hands and a habit of dropping extra bushels at the county food pantry at the end of every harvest without mentioning it to anyone. He'd lent my father money once when things were thin and told him not to rush paying it back. The kind of man who worried about the wrong things in the right ways. "Roland already has people interested," Darcy said. "A development company out of McLean. He called me this morning before the attorney even finished reading the document. Today was the reading." She nodded. "He also took my parking spot at the attorney's office." A short sound that might have been a laugh if the circumstances were different. I looked at the date on the papers, October 10th, 3 weeks out. "There's a note," she said. She pulled a smaller paper from inside the envelope, unfolded it carefully. "Dad wrote your name, not in the will itself, just with it. He said you were the one neighbor who understood what land was actually for." She held it toward me. I didn't take it right away. "What are you asking me, Darcy?" She looked at me then. Her eyes were red at the edges, but her voice was level when she said it. "I'm asking you to marry me." The garage went so quiet I could hear wind moving through the gaps in the east siding. I'd been meaning to seal those for 2 years. "I know how it sounds," she said. "I don't think you do." "I do." She said it quickly. "I know it's unfair. I know you have your own life. I know we haven't really spoken in years. But Roland will have that orchard flipped inside of 6 months. He's already told me the developer wants to put in a mixed-use community. 140 acres of peach trees, and he wants townhomes and a coffee chain on Route 20. I exhaled slowly. I'd seen it happen twice in this county already. A horse farm on Route 15, a dairy operation off 31. The survey flags go up, the machines come in, and a year later you can't find the fence line. "Are you trying to use me?" I asked. She went still, then quietly, "Yes. But I'm asking for help and I won't dress it up as something it isn't." That was harder to argue with than a polished answer would have been. I stood and walked to the open garage door and looked out at the dark. My property ran along the north side of the Lancaster orchard. 300 feet of shared fence I'd helped Harold mend the summer before my father died. I knew those trees. I'd grown up smelling them in bloom every April, the smell coming through my bedroom window when the wind shifted east. I turned back. "If I say yes, one condition." She sat up straighter, We don't lie to each other, not in private. To the outside world we do what the situation calls for, but between you and me we stay. You don't pretend this is love. I don't pretend I'm doing you some kind of favor. She nodded slowly, like she wanted me to see she'd actually heard it. Okay. And if Roland pulls something, you tell me before you try to handle it alone. I will. I looked at her in the bad fluorescent light of my shop, the blazer, the loose hair, the papers she'd driven all the way out here in the dark to show me. All right, I said. We'll go to the clerk's office in the morning. Something shifted in her face, but it wasn't exactly relief. It was closer to the look a person gets when they've been holding something heavy for a long time, and someone finally offers to carry the other end. The weight doesn't go away, it just changes shape. We went to the county clerk's office at 8 the next morning. Darcy wore a navy dress and boots. I wore the same clothes I wore when I wasn't covered in engine grease, which wasn't saying much. The clerk, a woman named Patrice who had processed my father's deed transfer 6 years ago, looked at us both with careful professional neutrality. Congratulations, she said, in a tone that meant she had questions she was choosing not to ask. We signed the license. A retired judge named Bowers with a small American flag pin on his lapel, the required words. It took 11 minutes. Darcy's hand was cold when I held it. Mine probably felt like the inside of a toolbox. When it was done, she looked at the certificate, like she was checking for errors. Now we keep the orchard standing, I said. She looked up at me instead of the paper. And that was the moment I understood, this wasn't going to stay simple. Darcy moved into my house that afternoon. She'd been staying at her father's house on the orchard property, but Roland still had a key, and she didn't trust him not to walk in unannounced. She brought 2 bags, a banker's box full of her father's files, and a single-serve coffee maker she said she couldn't function without. I cleared out the spare room at the end of the hall. Clean sheets, empty dresser, the window that looked east toward the orchard. Nothing fancy, but nothing cold either. She stood in the doorway with her bags still in her hands. The closet sticks, I said. You have to lift the handle while you pull. Thank you, Rhett. You don't have to keep thanking me. She looked at me sideways. Is that a rule? More of a preference. She almost smiled. The first week felt like 2 strangers who had memorized the floor plan but not the rhythms. She asked before she used the coffee maker, the stove, the good knife. I kept telling her she lived there now and kept feeling strange every time I said it. We ate at the same table and talked about the orchard, the way 2 people talk about a problem. They're both trying to solve from different angles. Darcy had grown up on those 140 acres, but she'd been in Richmond for 4 years doing design work. And in those years Harold had been running everything alongside a man named Hector, who had worked the Lancaster orchard since before Darcy was in high school. Hector knew the trees, the cold storage routine, the buyer's quirks. He wasn't sure yet who he was supposed to listen to. Roland showed up on day 3. He pulled up in a silver Audi that had never seen a gravel road before mine. He stood at the end of my driveway with his hands in his pockets, looking at my garage like it was a math problem he couldn't solve. I came out and he turned that look at me. Rhett Calloway, I said. Roland Lancaster. He said the last name like it was a credential. I'd like to speak with Darcy. She's at the orchard. He nodded slowly, studying the fence line between my property and hers. You understand this is an unusual arrangement. I understand you drove 2.5 hours on a Wednesday, so I'm guessing you've got something specific to say. He smiled the way men do, when they've already decided they're smarter than wherever they're standing. Just that this doesn't have to be difficult. Darcy isn't equipped to run a commercial orchard. She's been doing graphic work in the city for 4 years. The orchard needs professional management. And the most sensible path is a clean sale that gives her financial security. She's your sister, I said. Half-sister, no pause, and I care about her, which is exactly why I'm being realistic. I looked at him. She's at the orchard if you want to talk. He went, I followed at a distance. Darcy was near the cold storage building with Hector, going over the harvest count on a clipboard. She saw Roland's car and her shoulders moved inward by a 1/4 inch. I noticed. Hector noticed. Roland probably didn't. Darcy, he spread his hands like he was being reasonable. We need to talk about timing. Timing for what? For closing out the operation before the season fully ends. The developer needs to run surveys before the ground freezes, and the longer we stall. I'm not selling. He tilted his head. The will gives me authority as executor. To process the estate, not to decide what I do with my inheritance. Her voice was level. She held up her left hand, not dramatically, just enough. Roland looked at the ring, then at me, then back at her. He laughed once through his nose. "You've been married for 3 days, Darcy." The attorney confirmed compliance. "Your attorney. We'll be consulting separately." He turned to Hector. "Don't commit to any buyer contracts until this is properly sorted." Hector looked at Darcy, not at Roland. That 1 second told me something. "Hector," Darcy said, "confirm the Sunridge order this week, same as planned." Roland smiled and put his hands back in his pockets. He left without another word. Darcy watched his car until it reached the main road. Then she set the clipboard down on a crate and pressed one hand flat on top of it. "I didn't get a word out at first," she said. "You got plenty out by the end." "He talked over me twice." "He tried to." I leaned against the building. "Hector looked at you, not at him, that's what mattered." She looked toward where Hector had gone back to work. "First time usually isn't enough," I said. "Second time people start deciding." That afternoon she asked me to walk the orchard with her. Not to inspect anything specific, she just wanted to go through it. We walked the rows in the late October light. Most of the trees already picked out, a few late-season varieties still holding on. She reached up at one point and touched a branch without pulling anything from it. Just held it for a second, then let go. "I'd forgotten how big it actually is," she said. 140 acres looks different at 30 than it did at 12. She looked at me sideways. "How do you know how old I was at anything?" "You fell off the fence between our properties when you were about 12. Your father came over to check the line. I was 17 and thought the whole situation was very funny." She stopped walking. "I remember that. I did not know you were there." "I wasn't watching. I was repairing the fence. You just happened to be using it." She shook her head. And for the first time since she'd shown up at my garage, something in her face loosened. Not all the way, just enough to see it. The real test came a few days later, on a night when the Weather Service put out a frost advisory for the county. Darcy called me from the orchard at 10:30. She'd been going through her father's files and found records of 2 years Harold had lost most of the late crop to an early freeze. "How much is still out?" I asked. "Hector thinks maybe 12% of the Grimes Golden. They were running late because of the wet September." I was already pulling on my boots. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." We spent 3 hours in the dark with Hector and 2 other workers running the wind machines Harold had installed along the east rows, checking temperatures every 30 minutes, covering the most vulnerable sections of young trees near the road. With frost cloth we found folded in the equipment barn. It was cold and inconvenient and completely unglamorous work. Darcy didn't complain once. She asked Hector the right questions, listened to his answers, and when he told her where to position something she did it without making it into a discussion. By 2 in the morning, the temperature had stayed just above the damage threshold. We stood by the barn in the dark with our breath fogging. "We'll know more in daylight," Hector said, "but I think we held it." Darcy nodded. She had frostcloth fiber stuck in her hair and her jacket was damp at the elbows. She looked at Hector and said, "Thank you both of you, get some sleep." On the drive back to my house she was quiet for a long time. "He taught me where the frostcloth was," she finally said. "Hector, he didn't have to do that. He's been doing this 22 years, I said. "He doesn't want to start over somewhere else." She looked out the passenger window at the dark fields going by. "I don't want him to have to." Something in the way she said it, not about herself, not about the inheritance, just about Hector and 22 years, stuck with me longer than most things do. The days found their own rhythm after that. She stopped asking before she used things in my kitchen. She started calling suppliers herself, messing up once on a delivery window, and then calling back and fixing it without telling me until later. She came home one afternoon with the bridge of her nose sunburned. She tore the sleeve of her work jacket on a nail in the equipment barn, and kept working. One morning Hector called her instead of me with a question about the irrigation pump. She answered it, and handled it, and mentioned it at dinner, like it was an item on a list. "He called you," I said. "He did." She looked out the window, trying not to make too much of it. "He asked me." I didn't say anything, but I noticed. The estate meeting fell on a Thursday. Roland had filed a formal objection to the conditional compliance, arguing that the marriage had been contracted specifically to circumvent the will's intent, and should not be recognized as satisfying the clause. Mr. Caldwell, the estate attorney, was in his late 60s, and had known Harold Lancaster for over 2 decades. He had the look of a man who had seen this particular category of family behavior before, and found it professionally exhausting. Darcy came in with a folder twice the size of the one she'd shown me in my garage. Roland came in with grief and a printed argument. The marriage was executed within 72 hours of the will being read, Roland said. The motivation is transparent. Darcy entered a legal arrangement with a county resident solely to satisfy the clause, and is now claiming operational control of a commercial property she has no experience managing. Caldwell looked at Darcy. Your response? She opened her folder. She laid out the buyer contracts first, the cold storage inventory, the delivery agreement she'd negotiated herself, updated labor schedules with the seasonal workers, a repair authorization on the irrigation pump, a letter from Hector confirming she was the one making day-to-day decisions, 2 months of receipts, supplier correspondence with dates. Then she pulled out one more document, the frost advisory report from the county weather service, dated 3 nights ago with a handwritten note from Hector attached, held all 12%, no loss. Darcy made the call. Roland's attorney leaned over and murmured something. Roland's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. I'm not saying I know everything my father knew, Darcy said. I'm saying the orchard is running. The harvest came in. The buyers are confirmed. The workers are paid. The property is not for sale. She turned to Roland and her voice didn't waver. If Dad had wanted you managing this, he would have left it to you. He didn't. He left it to me with a condition that said I needed someone beside me who understood this land. And I found that person. You just don't like who it turned out to be. The room was very quiet. Roland's jaw worked once. You can't expect anyone to believe. I'm not asking you to believe anything, she said. I'm asking Mr. Caldwell to read what's in front of him. Caldwell spent 3 minutes going through the documents without speaking. Roland's attorney tried to interject once and was stopped with a raised hand. The marriage license satisfies the condition as written, Caldwell said finally. The documentation demonstrates active management of the Lancaster property by the designated heir. The challenge is declined. The estate proceeds with Darcy as sole operational principal. Roland stood fast enough that his chair scraped the floor. You'll be hearing from my attorney. You have every right to that process, Caldwell said pleasantly. Roland left. Grafe followed him with an apologetic half-nod to no one in particular. The room felt larger with them gone. Darcy sat with both hands flat on her folder. She didn't cry. She breathed out slowly, like something she'd been holding in her chest for 3 weeks had finally been allowed to settle. We walked out into the November air. The town moved around us the way small towns do, indifferent to whatever had just happened 2 floors above the sidewalk, busy with its own Thursday morning. A woman crossed the street with a bag of groceries. A delivery truck backed into the alley beside the hardware store. Darcy stopped beside my truck and looked at the ring on her hand. The orchard's safe, she said. Looks that way. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at me. So you don't have to do this anymore. I waited. The deal is done, she said. You helped me more than I had any right to ask anyone. If you want out of the paper, I won't fight it. You have your shop, your life, your... Darcy. She stopped. I leaned against the truck and looked at the street for a moment, at nothing in particular. I thought I came into this to help you keep your father's land. You did. Sure, I looked at her. But somewhere between the frost advisory at 2 in the morning and the way you handled Roland in that equipment yard, I stopped thinking about it as a favor I was doing and started thinking about it as somewhere I actually wanted to be. I paused. I know what my house felt like for 6 years before you moved into the spare room. And I know what it feels like now. Those aren't the same thing. Her eyes filled, but she held my gaze. That's not in the agreement, she said quietly. No, I said, it isn't. She reached out and took my hand, not like a gesture. Just the way you take something you've been looking at for a while, and finally decided you didn't want to walk past anymore. We drove back in the late morning light with the windows cracked. She had the post-hearing paperwork on her lap. I had 3 unread texts from Terrell asking about his truck. Neither of us said much because we didn't need to fill the air to make it feel like something. When we reached the fence line where my property ran into hers, I slowed down and looked out at the orchard. The rows ran back from the road toward the ridge, bare now, waiting for winter to finish and spring to start. My garage sat on the other side of the fence, the east wall patched with new lumber I'd finally gotten around to last month. Her land and mine side by side, not pretty in November, not easy in any season. Just there rooted, with a history that went further back than either one of us had been alive to see. She looked at it the same way I did. I pulled down my driveway and she got out like she belonged there. Because she did. and she didn't wait for me to say anything. She just held the door, and we walked into the house that had been quiet too long and wasn't anymore.